Math Chapter 11, Geometry and Fraction Concepts. Today we're looking at Lesson 11.11, Problem Solving with Equal Shares, the last lesson in our chapter. Let's take a look at our I can statement for today. It says, I can draw a diagram to help me solve a problem about equal shares. That means we're going to use what we've learned about fractions to help us draw equal shares to solve word problems today. Go ahead and open up your workbook to lesson 11.11. You'll need a pencil and a ruler if you want to use the ruler to help you draw your lines nice and straight. Let's start by taking a look at the Unlock the Problem page. Our first problem says there are two sandwiches that are the same size. Each sandwich is divided into fourths, but the sandwiches are cut differently. How might the two sandwiches be cut? We're going to follow our cube steps for all of our word problems today. So let's read that one more time. Make sure you're reading along with me. There are two sandwiches that are the same size. Each sandwich is divided into fourths, but the sandwiches are cut differently. How might the two sandwiches be cut? We've read it carefully twice. Now let's go ahead and underline the question and box up our key information. I underlined how might the two sandwiches be cut, and I've boxed up that each sandwich is divided into fourths. The sandwiches are cut differently. So that tells me I'm going to be dividing both sandwiches into fourths, or 4 equal parts, but I have to do it in 2 different ways. Take a look underneath Unlock the Problem. What do I need to find? How the sandwiches could be cut. That was taken right from the question. What information do I need to use? There are blank sandwiches. Each sandwich is divided into blank. Well, I know there are 2 sandwiches and that we're trying to divide them into fourths. Make sure you fill that in and you've spelled fourths correctly because it comes right from the problem. Now, they've already drawn the 2 sandwiches for me. My job is just to show how to divide them into fourths 2 different ways. So here are the examples I came up with. And again, I used my ruler to make sure I had nice straight lines. Make sure you filled everything in on that page and you used your cube steps in your word problem. Let's turn the page and take a look at the Try Another Problem section. It still says we're drawing to show your answer. Just like in our I can statement, we're drawing a diagram to help us with our word problems. Number 1 says, Marquise has 2 square sheets of paper that are the same size. He wants to cut each sheet into halves. What are 2 different ways he can cut the sheets of paper? Let's read that one more time. Marquise has 2 square sheets of paper that are the same size. He wants to cut each sheet into halves. What are 2 different ways he can cut the sheets of paper? All right, go ahead. Let's underline our question and box up our key information. I underlined what are 2 different ways he can cut the sheets of paper. And I boxed up cut each sheet into halves. That's a very important word in there, halves, because it tells me I'm cutting these sheets of paper into 2 equal pieces. That's what halves are. Again, though, when I look at that question, I have to do it in a different way each time. So here's 2 different examples of cutting those square sheets of paper into halves, 2 equal parts. Let's take a look at number 2. Shanice has 2 pieces of cloth that are the same size. She needs to divide each piece into thirds. What are 2 different ways she can divide the pieces of cloth? Let's read that one more time. Shanice has 2 pieces of cloth that are the same size. She needs to divide each piece into thirds. What are 2 different ways she can divide the pieces of cloth? All right, find that question mark, underline your question, and box up your key information. I underlined what are 2 different ways she can divide the pieces of cloth, and I boxed up to divide each piece into thirds. Remember, thirds are 3 equal parts. So each of these pieces of cloth have to be divided into thirds, and because of the question, I need to show it 2 different ways. Be careful with thirds. The easiest way to do thirds when you're doing a rectangle or a square is to use either vertical or horizontal lines, just like I did in my example. And it's kind of tricky with thirds as well. It's harder to see where you should draw your first line. If you think one of your pieces ended up too big, erase it and try it again. Remember, thirds are 3 equal parts. All right, let's move on to our next section, the share and show section. The directions are the same. Draw to show your answer. Brandon has 2 pieces of toast that are the same size. What are 2 different ways he could divide the pieces of toast into halves? All right, read it again with me. Brandon has 2 pieces of toast that are the same size. What are 2 different ways he can divide the pieces of toast into halves? Go ahead, underline your question, box up your key information. I underlined what are 2 different ways he can divide the pieces of toast into halves. My information that I boxed up is 2 pieces of toast that are the same size, and you'll notice in the question I also boxed up halves because it's telling me that I need to divide these pieces of toast into halves or 2 equal parts. Again, I have to show it 2 different ways. So here's 2 examples of dividing that square piece of toast into 2 equal parts. Let's take a look at number 4. Mr. Rivera has 2 small trays of pasta that are the same size. What are 2 different ways he can cut the pasta into fourths? Read that again with me. Mr. Rivera has 2 small trays of pasta that are the same size. What are 2 different ways he can cut the pasta into fourths? All right, go ahead, underline your question, box up your key information. We'll see if it matches mine. So I underlined what are 2 different ways he can cut the pasta into fourths. And then I boxed up 2 small trays of pasta that are the same size. Just like our last problem, there was a piece of key information in the question. I boxed up fourths because I know I'm going to be cutting these trays of pasta into fourths or 4 equal parts. Again, I need to show it 2 different ways. So here's what I did. Remember, take your time with your lines. If they don't look like quite the same size, one of them obviously looks very different, erase it and try it again. It's good to practice. Let's take a look at number 5. Erin has 2 ribbons that are the same size. What are 2 different ways she can divide the ribbons into thirds? Read it again with me. Erin has 2 ribbons that are the same size. What are 2 different ways she can divide the ribbons into thirds? Go ahead, underline your question, and then box up your key information. You should have underlined what are 2 different ways she can divide the ribbons into thirds, and then boxed up 2 ribbons that are the same size. And also, again in the question, we needed to box up thirds to tell us how to divide these 2 pieces of ribbon. Remember, I told you thirds, I think, are the trickiest to divide. So here's what I did to show thirds 2 different ways. Remember, diagonal lines don't work well with thirds when you're doing a rectangle or a square. All right, let's move on to the back page, problem-solving applications. Number 6 says, use diagrams. David needs to divide 2 pieces of paper into the same number of equal parts. Look at how the first piece of paper is divided. Show how to divide the second piece of paper a different way. Read that again with me. David needs to divide 2 pieces of paper into the same number of equal parts. Look at how the first piece of paper is divided. Show how to divide the second piece of paper a different way. All right, let's take a look at what I underlined and boxed up. So even though there isn't a question mark at the end of that last sentence, it is what I'm trying to find or show. It says, show how to divide the second piece of paper a different way. Then I boxed up Divide two pieces of paper into the same number of equal parts. Now, if I look at the first piece of paper, it's already divided into how many equal parts? We'll go ahead and count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that piece of paper is divided into fourths. I have to divide the next piece of paper into fourths as well, but I have to show it a different way. So here's how I showed fourths a different way. Let's take a look at number 7. Mrs. Lee has two sandwiches that are the same size. She cuts each sandwich into halves. How many equal parts does she have in all? Let's read that again carefully together. Mrs. Lee has two sandwiches that are the same size. She cuts each sandwich into halves. How many equal parts does she have in all? Let's go ahead and underline our question and box up our key information. You should have underlined how many equal parts does she have in all? And then boxed up, Mrs. Lee has two sandwiches that are the same size. She cuts each sandwich into halves. All right, there's a lot of information in this problem. First, I'm going to think about the question. I need to figure out how many equal parts she has in all. So I'm looking for the total number of parts. I know she has two sandwiches. Well, sandwiches are usually square shaped, so I'm going to draw two squares to start my diagram. Go ahead and draw two squares in your workspace. All right, then that next piece of information I boxed up says she cuts each of those sandwiches into halves. Well, halves are two equal parts. So go ahead and divide each of those sandwiches into halves, two equal parts. Yours might look a little different from mine, and that's okay because there's more than one way to show halves. So after I drew my two sandwiches and I divided them into halves, I counted up the number of equal parts, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 equal parts in all. Let's take a look at the last problem. So think smarter. It says Emma wants to cut a piece of paper into fourths. Fill in the bubble next to all the ways she could cut the paper. Well, if she's looking to cut her paper into fourths, how many equal parts should she have? You got it, 4. So let's take a look at each of these examples. The first example has 4 parts, and they're all equal or the same. So I can go ahead and fill that one in. That would be a good example. The next one has 1, 2, 3 parts. That would be thirds, so that would not be a way for Emma to cut her paper into fourths. The next example does have 4 pieces or parts, but are they equal? Definitely not. They're all different sizes, so I cannot fill that one in. And let's look at the last example. I have 4 parts, and yes, they are equal. They're all the same size, so I can go ahead and fill that one in as well. So here's what it should look like. The first and the last examples showed fourths or 4 equal parts. All right, awesome job on your problem set. Now it's your turn to try your homework on your own. You guys have been doing such an amazing job, so keep it up.